In Buckingham Palace, there exists a portrait that for decades did not officially exist. It was not listed in catalogs, it was not shown on guided tours, it did not appear in institutional publications. It was the presence of a woman that the oldest and most rigid institution in the Western world preferred not to acknowledge out loud. The mistress, the other woman, the one who was never meant to be queen. That woman is named Camilla Rosemary Shand. She was born on July 17th, 1947, in London. And on May 6th, 2023, crowned at Westminster Abbey alongside King Charles III, she became Queen of the United Kingdom. The woman who for 20 years was the most scandalous secret of the British monarchy, the one Diana Spencer called the third person in her marriage, the one the British public called a witch, achieved what in 1981 no one would have believed possible. She achieved everything. This is the story of how it happened. A story that begins much earlier than most people think, in a relationship that the system governing the royal family created and then tried to destroy, and that ultimately survived everything. The scandals, the divorces, Diana's death, the hostility of millions of people, and the judgment of history. To understand Camilla Parker Bowles, one must first understand the family she came from. Because the connection between the Shands and the British royal family does not begin with Charles and Camilla. It begins a century earlier, with a woman who was the discreet scandal of her time, and who turns out to be Camilla's great-grandmother. Alice Keppel was born in 1868 in Scotland, at Duntreath Castle. She was the daughter of Sir William Edmonstone, a baronet and admiral of the British Royal Navy. In 1891, she married Lieutenant Colonel George Keppel. And in 1898, when she was 29 years old, she met the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, who was 56. What began that night in a London salon became a relationship that would last 12 years, until the King's death in 1910. Alice Keppel became the most famous and influential mistress of Edward VII, his favorite, as he called her in private. She was discreet, intelligent, capable of softening the king's temper, and so skilled at navigating aristocratic circles that even Queen Alexandra, the legitimate wife, came to tolerate her publicly, even if privately she found her irritating. Alice Keppel had two daughters. The younger, Sonia Keppel, born in 1900, married Roland Cubitt, the third Baron Ashcombe. Sonia's daughter was Rosalind Cubitt, and Rosalind's daughter was Camilla Shand. The chain is direct and verifiable. The great-grandmother of the current Queen of the United Kingdom was, for 12 years, the mistress of the great-great-grandfather of the current king. When Camilla Parker Bowles and Prince Charles began their relationship in the early 1970s, they were not the first in their respective families to fall in love on the wrong side of a royal marriage. There is a phrase Alice Keppel uttered when Edward VIII abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, the divorced American whom the royal family would never have accepted as queen. Alice, already elderly, remarked with her characteristic irony, "These things were done much better in my day." What she meant was that in her time, mistresses had the good sense not to aspire to become legitimate wives. They stayed in the role assigned to them, and everyone pretended that role did not exist. Camilla Parker Bowles broke that unspoken rule when she finally married the heir to the throne in 2005. And by breaking it, she forever transformed the role a woman could have within the most conservative institution in the Western world. Camilla Rosemary Shand grew up between East Sussex and South Kensington. She was educated first in England, then in Switzerland, then in France, the standard path for young women of the British upper-class aristocracy in the 1960s. In 1965, at the age of 17, she was presented in society as a debutante, the ritual that marked the official entry of well-born young women into the upper-class social circuit. It was at those same social debut events that she met Andrew Parker Bowles, an officer in the Queen's Household Cavalry, and a lieutenant in the Blues and Royals Regiment. Andrew Parker Bowles was attractive, well-connected, known in the equestrian and military circles frequented by the royal family, and he had one particular trait that made him especially interesting in those circles. His parents were lifelong friends of the Queen Mother, and at the age of 13, Andrew had served as a page at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953. The relationship between Camilla and Andrew was, from the beginning, intermittent and complicated. They dated, separated, and got back together. Andrew, meanwhile, was also involved in a parallel relationship with Princess Anne, the daughter of Queen Elizabeth II. That alone says a great deal about the world Andrew Parker Bowles moved in. A man who could date both a royal princess and the daughter of a wine baron, without either situation seeming particularly unusual in his social circles. It was in this context, through their mutual friend Lucia Santa Cruz, daughter of the Chilean ambassador in London, that Camilla Shand met Prince Charles in the early 1970s. It was not at a polo match, as popular legend has repeated for decades. It was at Lucia Santa Cruz's home, where they were formally introduced. Charles was 23, Camilla was 24, 1 year and 4 months older than him. They shared interests, horses, country life, hunting, and a particular kind of British humor that does not require jokes to be funny, so much as situations to be observed with the right degree of detachment. What royal biographer Richard Fitzwilliams would later describe as kindred spirits, similar age, similar sense of humor, similar friends. Everything Charles and Diana did not have in common was present from the very beginning. The relationship became serious in 1971 and 1972. Charles was in love. Camilla was too. And then Charles had to leave. In January 1973, the Prince of Wales departed on a naval deployment with the Royal Navy. It was an obligation. He had no alternative. And while Charles was at sea, Andrew Parker Bowles returned to Camilla's life. In March 1973, Andrew proposed to her. Camilla accepted. The wedding took place on July 4th, 1973, at the Guards' Chapel in Wellington Barracks, London. It was a significant wedding. Among the guests were the Queen Mother and Princesses Anne and Margaret. More than 800 people attended. Charles was invited, but was in the Caribbean on an official engagement on behalf of the Queen and could not attend, or chose not to attend. Both versions circulate, and neither has ever been definitively confirmed. What is documented is that Charles received the news of Camilla's engagement to Andrew with a level of devastation that those who knew him clearly perceived. The man who in later decades would carry the public image of the cold and distant prince who had destroyed a fairy tale marriage with Diana was, in private, someone who had lost the woman he wanted to be with, and who never fully came to terms with it. Why didn't Camilla marry Charles in 1972? That question has several answers, depending on who is asked. The version that has circulated most widely is that the palace considered Camilla an unsuitable candidate to be the wife of the heir to the throne. Not because she came from a humble background, she did not. The Shands were a well-established aristocratic family, and Camilla's grandfather, the respected wine writer Bruce Shand, was a man of standing in the right circles. The problem was something else. The unwritten protocol surrounding the choice of a wife for the heir to the throne at that time required that the future queen have, using terms that would be unacceptable in any public conversation today, but were spoken without much hesitation in the 1970s, a sufficiently clean romantic past. Camilla had dated Andrew Parker Bowles. She had dated other men. She had what the palace environment called experience. And Lord Mountbatten, Charles's great-uncle and most influential mentor at the time, had written in a 1974 letter to the prince, that he believed it was troubling for a woman to have experiences if she then had to remain on a pedestal after marriage. Mountbatten advised Charles to find a girlfriend whose past was sufficiently unblemished to withstand the public scrutiny that would follow an engagement announcement. Charles listened to that advice, or the palace imposed it in ways that left little room for choice, and Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles. What followed that wedding is one of the most complex stories in 20th century British monarchy. Charles became godfather to Camilla and Andrew's son, Tom Parker Bowles, born on December 18, 1974. In 1978, Laura Parker Bowles was born. Charles remained close to both, moving within the same social circles and sharing the same equestrian interests. And at some point, between 1979 and 1980, the relationship became what it had been before Camilla's wedding. Both were married to other people. Neither had stopped loving the other. Charles's biographer and confidant, Giles Brandreth, places the rekindling of the relationship in 1979, after the assassination of Lord Mountbatten by the RIRA on August the 27th of that year. Mountbatten's death was a devastating loss for Charles, the man who had been his most influential father figure, his mentor, his confidant, his moral compass during years in which the royal institution provided none of those things, was suddenly gone. Charles sought support from those closest to him, and Camilla was one of them. Sources close to Andrew Parker Bowles confirm that by around 1980, the relationship between Charles and Camilla had once again become a romantic one. Andrew himself, according to those who knew them well, was not a particularly faithful husband. He had his own parallel relationships, and his marriage to Camilla functioned in practice as an open one. The system contained them all, and no one said out loud what everyone already knew. In 1980, Charles purchased the Highgrove estate in Gloucestershire as his private residence. The choice was not accidental. It was located just a few miles from Bolehide Manor, the country home of the Parker Bowles family. That geographic proximity was noted at the time by biographers with access to the prince's inner circle as a decision that reflected exactly what it seemed to reflect. It was during this same period that Charles began to look for a wife. Not a companion. A wife. Someone who met the requirements established by Mountbatten and the palace. And according to several biographical accounts, it was Camilla herself who helped. Charles assessed potential candidates. Camilla reportedly suggested that Lady Diana Spencer might be a suitable option. The irony of that situation, the woman who loved the prince helping him choose the woman he would marry, is difficult to surpass. Camilla knew exactly what she was doing. Charles knew exactly what he was doing. And they both did it anyway, because the system left them with no alternative but that or a complete break. Diana Frances Spencer was 19 years old when she became engaged to Prince Charles in February 1981. She had spent her childhood at Park House on the Sandringham estate and had known the royal family since she was a child. She was the youngest daughter of Viscount Althorp, later Earl Spencer. On paper, she was exactly what the system required. Young, aristocratic, with no known romantic past, a virgin according to all sources at the time, spoken of with a lack of discretion that feels striking today, and willing to assume the role that marriage to the heir to the throne entailed. What Diana did not know, or did not want to know, or knew but hoped could change, was that the man she was about to marry had been in love with another woman for years. Before the wedding, Diana found a bracelet in the desk of Charles's personal assistant that he had commissioned for Camilla as a farewell gift, a way of marking the supposed end of that relationship before beginning married life. The inscription, according to accounts from the time, included the initials of the affectionate nicknames Charles and Camilla used for each other. Diana confronted Charles. Charles reassured her, and the wedding took place on July 29th, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral, before an audience of 750 million viewers worldwide. Andrew Parker Bowles was present at that wedding, serving on duty with the household cavalry, helping protect the bride and groom. He was part of the official procession. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, was also there. Camilla watched the ceremony as a guest among the crowd. Some biographers have noted that Diana tried to prevent Tom Parker Bowles from being included in the wedding procession, a reaction her inner circle interpreted as a reflection of the hostility she already felt toward anything associated with Camilla. The selection of Diana Spencer as the future Princess of Wales was, in many ways, the direct product of the system's failure to manage the relationship between Charles and Camilla. Because what the palace was looking for in 1980 and 1981 was exactly the opposite of what Camilla represented: a candidate with no history, no public romantic experience, no past that tabloids could turn into ammunition. The system that had rejected Camilla in 1972 for having too much of a past sought in 1981 someone who had none. Diana Spencer fit that profile almost too perfectly. She was 19. She had barely dated anyone. She was the daughter of an earl, aristocratic enough for the formal requirements and young. Enough to have spent her adolescence outside the social circuit where tabloids might have documented any relationships. She worked at a nursery school in Pimlico. She lived with friends. She did not have the kind of life that generates stories. The palace did exactly what Lord Mountbatten had advised: find someone new enough that the map of her past would be blank. The problem is that no human being is blank. Diana Spencer had her own complexities, her own wounds, her own emotional needs, things the selection process for a royal bride was not designed to evaluate. Her childhood had been marked by her parents' divorce when she was 8, by the loss of her mother, who left with another man, and by the isolation that comes from growing up in a fractured family within one of the most public worlds imaginable. Diana needed love. She needed stability. What her marriage to Charles gave her was protocol and loneliness. The incompatibility between Charles and Diana was structural, not circumstantial. It wasn't only that Charles loved someone else, although that was true and added a specific layer of cruelty to the situation. It was that Charles and Diana were fundamentally different in temperament, in interests, in the way they related to the world, in what they needed from a relationship. Charles was introspective, classically educated in a narrow sense, interested in architecture, alternative medicine, and sustainable agriculture. He was uncomfortable with grand emotional gestures and with the kind of attention Diana naturally generated. Diana, on the other hand, was instinctive, emotional, capable of connecting with people in suffering in a way Charles never could, and completely bewildered by the institutional distance Charles had been raised to maintain. Their marriage was unhappy from very early on. Those who witnessed it from within and later described it consistently point to the same factors: the difference in age and maturity, the incompatibility of temperaments, the absence of shared interests, and the constant presence of Camilla as a shadow that Diana felt at all times, even when she could not always identify it precisely. Charles, in later reflections, described a marriage he tried to keep functioning, but that had already been broken by the time it reached the altar. Diana, in the recordings she provided to biographer Andrew Morton for the book Diana, Her True Story, published in 1992, described an experience of isolation, misunderstanding, and betrayal that led her to bulimia, self-harm attempts, and a depression the royal institution was neither equipped nor willing to manage. The relationship between Charles and Camilla resumed around 1986, as established by multiple sources. Charles was not happy in his marriage. Camilla remained the one person with whom he felt entirely himself, without the weight of protocol, without the constant obligation to be the Prince of Wales, without the pressure of an institution that had shaped every aspect of his life since birth. Camilla was the person with whom he could simply be Charles. The scandal that made that relationship public property arrived in the most unexpected way, through a radio enthusiast who happened to scan the right frequency at the right time. On the night of December 18th, 1989, Charles was at the home of the Duchess of Westminster in Cheshire. Camilla was at Bolehide Manor, her country house. The two spoke on the phone for 6 minutes. The conversation was recorded, according to the official version, by an amateur who accidentally intercepted the signal. Though there are also alternative theories suggesting the recording may have been made by intelligence agencies such as MI5 or GCHQ and later leaked deliberately, none of those claims have ever been definitively proven. The recording remained unpublished for more than 3 years. The Daily Mirror had it in its possession from 1992, but editor Richard Stott chose not to publish it at the time, considering it too damaging to the monarchy. It was the Australian magazine New Idea that first published the transcript on January 13th, 1993. 4 days later, British tabloids followed, and the content reached millions of readers. The conversation was intimate, explicitly sexual, and contained a remark from Charles that became one of the most infamous tabloid headlines in British media history. Joking about his desire to always be close to Camilla, Charles said that if he were reincarnated, he would like to return as her tampon so he could always be there. Camilla laughed in response. The fragment, taken out of context and turned into a headline, was the kind of thing the system cannot undo once it enters public circulation. Diana's former bodyguard, Ken Wharf, later described the public reaction as savage. People who were normally loyal to the future king were horrified. Some openly questioned his suitability to rule. Diana herself described the recording as sick. The scandal, quickly dubbed Camillagate by the press, not only damaged Charles's image, it accelerated the public collapse of his marriage to Diana, who had already separated from him in December 1992. It also pushed Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles toward divorce. After 21 years of marriage, they formally began proceedings in December 1994. The divorce was finalized on March 3, 1995. A year earlier, on June 29, 1994, a documentary titled Charles, The Private Man, The Public Role, had aired on ITV, presented by Jonathan Dimbleby. It was watched by over 13 million people. The documentary was Charles's attempt to regain control of his public image after years of decline, but it included a moment no one at the palace had fully anticipated. Dimbleby asked him whether he had been faithful and honorable to his wife during his marriage vows. Charles answered, "Yes, absolutely." Dimbleby pressed further, "And you were?" Charles replied, "Yes." Then, after a pause that anyone who has seen the footage remembers, he added, "Until it broke down irretrievably, us both having tried." Shortly afterward, his private secretary confirmed in a press briefing that the woman in question was Camilla Parker Bowles. What very few people knew at the time was that Charles had recorded 2 versions of the documentary. In the first, he did not admit to adultery. He was later persuaded by advisors that the truth would eventually emerge anyway, and that it would be better for it to come out in a controlled and sympathetic context rather than through leaks or investigative journalism. The second version, the one that aired, was recorded at Highgrove. Charles later wrote to a friend that it had been what one might call living dangerously, but difficult to avoid in those times. The confession had the opposite effect of what his advisors had hoped. Instead of closing the wound, it tore it wide open, and it pushed Diana to give her own interview. The interview Diana gave to the BBC program Panorama in November 1995, conducted by journalist Martin Bashir, was watched by 200 million people worldwide. In it, Diana delivered the sentence that would forever define the public narrative of her marriage to Charles. There were three of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. The line was direct, memorable, devastatingly effective, and it pointed, without naming her, exactly to where Camilla existed in the story. Diana also admitted to her own infidelities, including a relationship with Army officer James Hewitt. But the damage the interview caused to Charles and to the palace was far greater than anything that could affect Diana, whose popularity remained extraordinary until her death. The divorce between Charles and Diana was finalized on August 28, 1996. Diana received a settlement of £17 million and shared custody of Princes William and Harry. She retained the title Princess of Wales but lost the style of Her Royal Highness. A year later, on August 31, 1997, Diana died in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. And with her death, Camilla Parker Bowles found herself in the most difficult position she had ever occupied. The wife was no longer between her and Charles, but Diana in death was far more powerful than Diana in life had ever been. The global wave of mourning that followed, the flowers piled outside palace gates, the millions in the streets of London on the day of the funeral, the speech by Diana's brother at Westminster Abbey accusing, in veiled but unmistakable terms, those with blood on their hands, created a climate in which Camilla became, temporarily, the most hated public figure in Britain. The windows of her country house were smashed. The press portrayed her as the villain of the story, the woman who had ruined the perfect marriage and contributed to the tragedy of the people's princess. In the years immediately following 1997, the idea that Charles and Camilla might one day marry was considered by palace advisors to be something that could irreparably damage the monarchy. The relationship was not just unpopular, it was politically explosive. It was in this context that Charles hired Canadian PR advisor Mark Bolland, known in palace circles as the Mole, whose specific mission was to rehabilitate Camilla's image. Bolland designed a strategy that analysts later described as a model of calculated patience. The goal was not to suddenly present Camilla as the prince's new partner. It was to introduce her into public life so gradually, so subtly, that the public would come to accept her before fully realizing what they were accepting. The connection between Camilla's great-grandmother and Charles's great-great-grandfather gained new symbolic weight. Writer Christopher Wilson described it as history repeating itself, but with a different ending. Alice Keppel had been Edward VII's favorite for 12 years, and she died, as what she had always been, the mistress. Elegant, discreet, admired, but never queen. Her great-granddaughter began in exactly the same role and ended where Alice never did. The irony was not just personal, it was institutional. The system that in 1898 knew exactly how to contain a royal mistress without threatening the established order proved incapable of doing the same a century later. When Edward VII was dying, Alice Keppel was reportedly so overcome with grief that she had to be removed from the room when the king lost consciousness. Queen Alexandra, who had tolerated Alice's presence for years, is said to have declared, "Take that woman away." That was the boundary the system imposed. In the king's grief, the mistress had no place. Camilla Parker Bowles did not meet the same fate. When Charles III spoke of her in his first speech as king, he called her "my darling wife." When he was proclaimed king before the Accession Council, she stood present as a witness. And when he was crowned at Westminster Abbey, she was crowned beside him. The difference between Alice Keppel's fate and Camilla's is not only a difference of eras, it is the result of Camilla's own decisions, her patience, and her persistence. Alice never aspired to be queen, because in her time, that would have been social madness. Camilla never openly declared such an ambition. but she also never abandoned the relationship that led her there. Two different strategies, two different systems, two completely different outcomes. The global mourning following Diana's death had a paradoxical effect on Camilla's position. In the short term, it destroyed her publicly. Her name became synonymous with the villainy blamed for Diana's suffering and death. She could not appear in public without hostility. But in the long term, Diana's death also removed the only figure capable of competing with Charles for public attention and affection, and doing so overwhelmingly. Without Diana, the narrative of the British monarchy had to be rewritten, and Charles was the only protagonist left to rewrite it. The rehabilitation strategy designed by Mark Bolland was based on a principle any public relations professional would recognize. People do not suddenly change their minds about figures they have decided to hate. They change gradually, almost without noticing, as the images they receive begin to contradict the narrative they once believed. Bolland understood that trying to convince the public they were wrong about Camilla would fail. Instead, he worked to give them reasons to form a different opinion on their own. The steps were calculated with precision. First, a discreet joint appearance at the Ritz in 1999. Then, her inclusion in private royal family events that were quietly leaked to the press. After that, appearances at charitable engagements, where coverage was naturally positive because the context itself was positive. Her presence at the Queen Mother's funeral in 2002 was especially significant. Camilla appeared at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, setting defined institutional respect, completely incompatible with the image of the The public, seeing her there, was no longer seeing the other woman. They were seeing someone accepted by the royal family, and someone who respected. Queen Mother had been the strongest internal opponent of Camilla's recognition within the royal family. Her loyalty to Diana, her long-standing friendship with Spencer, and her deeply traditional view of monarchy made her firmly resistant to the idea of Camilla having any official role. She died on March 30, 2002, at the age of 101. The last internal barrier had disappeared. Queen Elizabeth II handled the issue with the quiet mastery that defined her reign. She made no public declarations for years. She gave no clear signals, but neither did she actively oppose Charles as he gradually integrated Camilla into family life. Their first, relatively informal meeting was widely reported as symbolically important, even though it was deliberately low-key. The Queen's presence said what she hadn't stated in words. She accepted the situation. The steps forward remained cautious. Charles and Camilla were seen together publicly for the first time in January 1999, leaving the Ritz Hotel after a birthday party for Camilla's sister. No romantic gesture, no declaration, just presence. From there, the appearances became more frequent, but always at the pace the situation required. Camilla began attending official engagements alongside Charles. In 2002, she appeared at the Queen's Golden Jubilee celebrations. Then, on February 10, 2005, Clarence House officially announced the engagement between the Prince of Wales and Camilla Parker Bowles. The wedding was scheduled for April 8, 2005, but was postponed by one day due to the death of Pope John Paul II. The ceremony took place on April 9th at Windsor Guildhall. It was not a church wedding. As future Supreme Governor of the Church of England, Charles could not remarry in a traditional Anglican ceremony. A civil ceremony was the constitutional solution, followed by a religious blessing at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. Camilla did not take the title Princess of Wales, which would have been hers by right. That title was too strongly associated with Diana in public memory. Instead, she became Duchess of Cornwall. At the time, Clarence House also announced that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Princess Consort, not Queen. reflecting the reality that public acceptance, while improved, still had limits. What the palace did not fully anticipate was how quickly public opinion continued to evolve. The relatively quiet wedding in 2005 was received more calmly than expected. Over time, Camilla built credibility the only way possible, through consistent work. Hospital visits, charity events, public appearances alongside Charles. She developed her own causes, particularly osteoporosis awareness, literacy, support for victims of sexual violence, and animal welfare. Those who met her in these contexts described her consistently: warm, approachable, unpretentious, capable of connecting with people from all walks of life without the distancing effect of royal protocol. Then, in February 2022, Queen Elizabeth II made a decisive move. In her Accession Day message, she expressed her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort when Charles became king. It was the monarch's final endorsement. The woman whose presence had once been the greatest scandal in the royal family was now publicly declared worthy of its highest title. Queen Elizabeth II died on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle. Charles immediately became King Charles III. Camilla became Queen Consort. In his first address to the nation, Charles spoke of his darling wife Camilla, praising her loyalty and dedication to duty. At the Accession Council, she stood as witness to his proclamation. On May 6, 2023, Camilla was crowned at Westminster Abbey alongside Charles III, the first coronation in 70 years. The invitations referred to her simply as Queen Camilla. A typographical detail, perhaps, but one that marked the end of a 50-year journey. The woman once deemed unsuitable was now queen. The Independent named her the most influential woman of 2023. And then again in 2024 and 2025 and 2026. It was a reflection of the moment. The woman who had spent 20 years being portrayed as the greatest problem of the British monarchy had become one of its most valuable assets. But Camilla's story is not only the story of a successful image rehabilitation. It is also the story of a question that remains unresolved, and that changes depending on who is asking it. Did the crown choose Camilla, or did Camilla choose the crown? The version defended by her strongest critics, most notably Prince Harry in his memoir Spare, is that Camilla played a long and deliberate game from the beginning. That her relationship with Charles was not just love, but also strategy. That her patience over decades of public rejection reflected someone who knew time would ultimately work in her favor. Harry wrote that his stepmother had played the long game, with a campaign aimed at marriage and eventually the crown, with his father's blessing. It is a harsh interpretation, and it comes from someone with obvious reasons to see it that way. The opposite version is offered by her son, Tom Parker Bowles, who has equally clear reasons to see it differently. He has said publicly that there was no end game, no grand strategy, that his mother simply married age, same humor, same circle, everything Charles and Diana lacked. Historian Ariane Chernock added another layer. Camilla, no matter what she does, will always be divisive. That is precisely what makes Camilla Parker Bowles' story so difficult to reduce to a single interpretation. In any honest assessment, both narratives contain truth. Camilla loved Charles. That seems undeniable after 50 years. Camilla also married Andrew Parker Bowles, knowing Charles would remain in her life. Camilla was the third person in a marriage that caused real suffering to Diana. And Camilla endured decades of public hatred with a composure her defenders called dignity and her critics call calculation. The dynastic connection to Alice Keppel adds a final layer almost too perfect to ignore. Her great-grandmother was the mistress of a king. She became the queen. The difference is not just time, it is transformation. The Camillagate scandal also had a parallel rarely emphasized. Just 2 weeks after Charles's recorded conversation, Diana herself was involved in another leaked call, later known as Squidgygate, with James Gilby, revealing her own emotional dependence and unhappiness. Yet the impact was not symmetrical. Charles was judged, Diana was forgiven, the public needed a villain, and Camilla fit the role perfectly. What almost no one predicted was her ability to endure. Those who knew her during the years of greatest hostility described someone who kept her head down, avoided public confrontation, refused to justify herself, and simply continued. Critics called it calculation. Supporters called it strength. It was probably both. Because the real question, whether Camilla chose the crown or the crown chose Camilla, assumes there was ever a clean choice to be made. History suggests something more complex. The system tried to separate them and failed. It tried to replace her and failed. It tried to control the narrative and lost control of it. Camilla became queen not because the system chose her, but because it could not stop her from being there. Because Charles never stopped loving her. Because she never walked away. And because time, always, favors those who endure long enough. Westminster Abbey, where Charles and Diana married in 1981 before 750 million viewers in a fairy tale spectacle, became in 2023 the stage of something very different. Not illusion, but resolution. Diana was not right. As many have said, her absence was its own form of presence. There is one question history will never answer. What if Charles had married Camilla in 1972? Diana might have lived a completely different life. The monarchy might have avoided its greatest crisis of the 20th century. Everything might have been different. But the system chose differently and paid the price. And in the end, it arrived at the same destination it once tried to avoid. Camilla's story resists simplification. She is not only the woman who stood between a prince and his marriage, she is also the woman who, for over 50 years, was the emotional anchor of a man who could not have functioned without her. That kind of presence cannot be manufactured. It either exists or it doesn't. There is also a more personal dimension often overlooked: the cost. Camilla endured a level of sustained public hatred that few private individuals in modern democracies have experienced. She was not a politician who could respond publicly, not an actress who could withdraw from public life. She was simply someone who loved a man and paid the price for it in full view of the world. Those who knew her described a person very different from the tabloid caricature: warm, self-aware, humorous, deeply loyal. Ingrid Seward, editor of Majesty magazine, said of her, "When you meet her, she doesn't seem distant at all. She's always the same." And that consistency may have been her greatest strength. Because in the end, the coronation of 2023 was not just a ceremony. It was the public conclusion of a private story that had been unfolding for over 50 years. A story of scandal, resistance, loss, patience, and endurance. The crown did not choose love, but love eventually reshaped the crown. And that is why this story is not simple. It is human. And that is the only thing it could ever be.